Welcome to the Water People podcast, where we talk story with some of the most adept waterfolk on the planet. I'm your host, Lauren Hill, joined by my partner, Dave Rastovich. Water People is a place to acknowledge and share the aquatic experiences that shape who we become back on land. This season is supported by Patagonia, whose purpose-driven mission is to use business to save our home planet. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the Bundjalung Nation, the traditional custodians of the land and waters where we work and play, who have cared for this sea country for tens of thousands of years. Respect and gratitude to all First Nations people, including elders past, present, and emerging. Today we're in conversation with surf journalist Stu Nettle. Stu is a lifelong surfer, but latecomer to surf media. He, quote, had many unrelated life chapters, business failures, social experiments, and surf adventures before he ever got a word published. We first encountered Stu's work amongst the lively pages of Kurungaba, an academic-leaning surf journal he helped found and run in the early 2000s. It was a trove of thoughtful essays, along with poetry, fiction, and interviews, and part of a larger, exciting, independent DIY surf culture of that time. Since 2008, Stu has been the editor of Swellnet, one of Australia's foremost independent surf forecasting and media outlets, where Stu explores board design, surf industry happenings, surf science, and coastal geology.
I'd connected with Stu earlier in the year when I had the idea of putting on a surfing day that would essentially give our community around here, or a small portion of it anyway, the opportunity to ride a surfboard from every decade spanning the last 120 years of time. And I was lit up about it because we had all kinds of crafts, some pretty obscure ones, and the day was a success. Everyone really loved it.
It was so much fun.
It was so wonderful, and it's a blueprint for doing these at another time when they're needed, perhaps, if a community needs to get together for any reason. And I remember speaking with Stu because I think he had gotten wind of it and wanted to know if we wanted to share that story in any way. And so when I started telling him about the boards, he just knew them. He knew actually way more than me about a few of them too, especially the Tommy Peterson Fireball Fish with the belly channels, and Dane Kealoha, short little town and country, twin fins, and Oki flat rocketed 80s thrusters and stuff. Anyway, he just dorked out big time. And I was really impressed because I really love that aspect of the surfing culture where you have people who are in storytelling positions or who are in big decision-making positions with surf companies who know their shit, who are still surfers, who are deeply into it and want to keep that flame burning. And I really felt that with Stu. And I know that in my experience, where I'd seen over the decades in the surfing industry, companies be taken over by suits and with just the corporate dollar as the bottom line, it didn't lead anywhere exciting, wonderful, vibrant and healthy. It just led to a few making a lot of money and then everyone else being basically ripped off in one way or another. So I've got a bit of a soft spot with that side of the surfing organism. I love when people like Stu are in those positions, like his position with Swellnet, that curates discussions and tells stories and features movies and does the forecasting thing and stuff too.
Swellnet's really interesting to me because they're one of the few independent surf forecasting and media outlets, pretty much the foremost example of that in Australia. And I just thought it would be so interesting to learn about who the main storytellers are. And in Stu's case, he's the editor, so he's making the editorial calls about direction. And I think it's really important to understand who our storytellers are, what their life experiences are, what's their point of view, what's their perspective. And of course, I was really keen to ask Stu about gender. You can still flick up Swellnet, look at their homepage, and there's not really a sign of women anywhere. We talk about that a little bit in the conversation. And I appreciated his answer. He sort of spoke to the menschettery aspect of the space that he's curating and
menschettery. So when you say that, so people understand what you're saying there, because I don't know if men's shed is
Men's
a
shed,
global
yeah. No, it's not.
thing.
It's pretty Australian, I think.
What is from your point of view, Lara, what is a men's shed?
Yeah, it's a place of men's work and bonding through physical labor, kind of conversation happening alongside a project of some sort. That's what is that how you see it too?
Yeah, and I guess that probably one of the central aspects of the men's shed is that it's a somewhat safe space for blokes to open up and perhaps talk about something they're struggling with or something they might need help or advice with, and that's a healthy thing, especially in this day and age where there is a lot of discussion around toxic masculinity, and suicide rates with men are really high in Australia, and that's a space where it can be okay to stumble and say stupid things because you're just with mates who will go, hey, actually, you might want to change your thinking about this or that or whatever. So it's a bit of that.
Really important space. And it was interesting to hear him frame Swellnet in those terms. And also it made me wonder about the state of surf media and how all of our mainstream sort of outlets, mags, websites, blogs, whatever, if the people at the helm of those are all feeling like, well, this is our men's space, then when does women's news and surfing get included and folded into the mix as normal surfing and not as something cleaved off and separate from, quote, real surfing? So, yeah, I love chatting with Stu and hearing about his story, and also it planted more questions in my mind about just looking at where are the magazines at in terms of inclusivity? Where are the websites at in terms of inclusivity? And who are the storytellers who are genuinely following their own curiosities to tell stories, as opposed to, we have one big centralized global outlet now that's dominating surf forecasting and surf storytelling in some ways. And those stories are very much driven by advertorial. It's pay to play. And what you're being fed, what we're being fed through that site is about the dollar as the bottom line. So outside of that, I wanted to hear from someone like Stu.
Yeah, and also remembering that our first encounter with seeing his name at the end of a story was with Kurungaba, and that's a space, I don't know, I can't remember what the byline is, but it's like a sharing of ideas, and that came across our bow probably a decade ago with Taylor Miller, and Taylor dropping off a stack of Kurungabas at the cabin, and we'd sit by the fire and read through them, and they were fantastic. So if you ever come across Kurungaba, copies of it at the local tip shop or a library or someone's toilet or wherever they are stacked,
I think they ran for a few years, and they had great minds behind the editorial team: Rebecca Olive, Clifton Evers, our neighbor Taylor Miller, Rusty Miller's daughter. And Kurungaba was part of this sort of bubbling up of creative DIY culture in surfing that felt very on the other end of the spectrum from the very jock corporate surfing culture that was strong and well-funded at the time. And it makes me think a lot about how we're in a place right now where I feel confused about what's going to happen. It feels like a real time of fermentation in surf culture. It's like, I don't feel certain whether we're going to end up with something that's gone rancid and funky, or if it's going to turn into something healthy and nutritious culturally.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great metaphor, a great way to see it. And who knows? Right now, it's so mysterious, actually. I can't project my mind into the future and say, oh, yeah, there's going to be 100% a growth of cottage industry aspects of surfing where you see tiny little zines and things pop up, or you're going to see tiny companies popping up all over the place. We've
just lost another magazine here in Australia. White Horses has stopped printing. Yeah. So we have Tracks, and we have Surfing World, and I think Surfing Life. And in the States, I don't know if there's the Surfer's Journal. Yep. Print media is really struggling right now. It seems like podcasting is sort of stepping in a way, but there really aren't those centralized sources. And maybe that's a good thing.
Exactly. You can't look at it as just a diminishment in a negative way. It does feel like, we've thrown everything into a big pot and, or a big glass jar and tied some muslin cloth over the top, and we're all in the dark somewhat and fermenting. And I hope healthy things come of it. And I like the idea that There are people in positions like Stu's that are water people. They're cooked. Their lips are sunburnt. They've been out in the water all day with their kids. They've been having radical mountain biking crashes, which is the state we found Stu in when we were talking with him, healing after one of those adventures. And it was an enjoyable conversation.
We always begin these conversations by asking about a time or experience after which you were never the same. Can you share with us about a time or moment from your life like that?
Yeah, I can. It's a really good question. It sort of causes you to look back over your life and then look forward again. The answer needs a little bit of context. I need to sort of rewind a little bit and sort of explain the sort of person I was as a teenager and youth. And I was quite highly strung and judgmental and anxious and politically aware too. I had the weight of the world on my shoulders. I looked around at people that were happy-go-lucky, and that was a long way from where I was. And so I think because of that, like, I didn't like myself a lot, and I was a really hard taskmaster of other people too, unfairly, but that's the way I was. And to get to the actual moment, it means like it was January of 2001 and Sunset Beach in Hawaii. And it was about 3 months into a seasonal stay, my second time that I'd stayed for a season in Hawaii. I can't remember the actual date, but I can remember the conditions quite clearly. And that was that it was a big stormy north swell, and sunset in a north swell can be quite unpredictable. You think you're out as far as you need to be, and there's always sets breaking further and further and further out. You're just way out to sea. They're coming at you sort of from the northeast, and it's really hard to line yourself up. But as I said, I'd been there since October. I was really, really fit, absolutely battle-hardened. Nothing, even though the lineup was hard to make sense of, I wasn't particularly scared of it. But I took off on one wave, I'd say probably 12, a good 12-foot north swell wave. Everything going okay, but it was a late drop, and I nosedived quite viciously too, straight over. I'm a natural footer, straight over at high speed onto the side of my head. And instantly into a really deep fog where I didn't know what was happening. I had no idea at all what was going on. It wasn't like a wipeout that I'd experienced before. And in one moment, I was looking at the sky, and then I'd realised I was going over the falls, but I wasn't feeling the sensation of it. At that moment, then I'd realised I'd broken my eardrum and broken it quite badly. And so I had vertigo. I didn't know which way was up or down. And I didn't get a breath when I could have. I was looking at the sky, my head was clear of the lip, but I didn't get a breath. And to cut a long story short, it was a really, really bad wipeout, to the point where I was thinking to myself, if I don't breathe in the next couple of seconds, that's it, I'm giving up. Like, I went through stages of relaxation and panic. And I was thinking, I have to breathe. And then I touched the bottom. I was swimming down. And I had on my Waimea leggy, so that was like a 30-foot long leg rope or whatever it was. So it was giving me no indication of which way I was up, and I'd touched the bottom, and things went downhill from there. I had 2 waves went overhead. I ended up breathing in a lot of water, and I don't remember much more after that. And my first recollection was looking at a palm tree upside down, coming to on the beach at sunset, and having a lifeguard clear my lungs, and looking at a huge wad of foam, blood-flecked foam, all across my stomach and my chest, and with people all around me just staring at me. And I was confused. I didn't know what was going on. And I ended up going into the American medical system, or tried to. They denied me every part of the way, even though I had travel insurance. So I ended up having to pay for it all up front. And I ended up sort of clocking up 2 credit cards that I wouldn't normally have touched, going to an ear, nose and throat specialist in Waikiki. And I think it was about $8,000 in money that I went through. I expected to claim it all back when I got home. And I did get home on mid-March, March 15th or something, 2001, and seeing that the headlines in the newspapers that day that HIH collapsed. I had no idea what HIH was until I went to claim my travel insurance and realised that they were the underwriters.
Oh, wow.
So, and in those days, like 2001, when the Australian dollar was like the peso of the Pacific, they said, it was 50 cents to the American dollar. And so my $8,000 went from $8,000 to $16,000. I'd had this, what I don't take lightly, but I had what was pretty close to a near-death experience there. And I found myself in a really, really deep hole. I didn't have a job. I quit my job before I went over to Hawaii. I was having all these bad thoughts about how close I'd how close I'd come, and I just had no resources whatsoever. I was massively in debt, no job, and the whole thing. It took me a really, really long time to process it. Probably about 6 months to really sort of smile about it, laugh about it, philosophize about it. But what happened eventually over the course of however long, and looking at it and looking at that moment that could have been, that could have turned out so dramatically different. I kind of felt that I was a different person in that I'd let go of a lot of things. I looked upon things differently. It was almost like, to me, a B, C, A, D kind of separation there. That it may seem a little bit sort of cloudy to other people, but when I kept looking back on it, I came out a different person. I was less judgmental. I was less beholden to beliefs. I was more open to absurdity and to chance and to forgiveness in other people, forgiveness in myself. All these things might have come with maturity. It was at that age where you're changing anyway, but I tend to pin it down to that moment. It was really, really dramatic. It dominoed into something that really shadowed my life for a long time. And it's something that I look back on and I kind of think, wow, it's for everything, for all that, it was hard, it was tough, but almost worth it, I think, in the end. And it, from what I'm working in now, where I work around a lot of other people, I do have to give my opinion a lot. I think I'm a little bit less judgmental and I'm a little bit more open to other people's ideas, to other people's beliefs, to other people's foibles. And possibly it's just because I was forced to let go of all my own.
Wow. How many times do you think that's happened at that surf spot? It's
crazy.
It's remarkable to think that
it's
a location.
We're sort of mythologizing Sunset Beach on the podcast this season. We've had a couple Sunset Beach stories.
Yeah.
Building up the reputation there of that wave.
I'm so fond of the wave. I didn't surf it after that event. I didn't go back. I had to get my life back into water. There was so much I had to do. But I went back a few years ago and surfed it again. And it was so good to paddle out there. I just felt like I had a target on my back and I was waiting to get cleaned up again. I couldn't remember it and surf it the way I used to, but it was so good to go back there. It's just unreal.
Are you familiar, Stu, with the ancient the Palmalu story of that wave? Yeah. Which is just,
absolutely.
Isn't it great that it's such a teaching of, of us mere mortals getting ahead of ourselves, thinking we're just king shit out there, and then being deeply humbled. And that story goes back through way back through so many worldly changes, and yet it's still happening to us. All of us, I think pretty much everyone who's been there and surfed there has had some sort of humbling moment where you go, oh, yeah, I should probably rein myself in a little bit. It's fascinating.
I love that, Dave, that these days there's lots of conjecture about where surfing first started. People talk about it like maybe Peru or the Chinese in the river bores, but Hawaii has the continuity. Hawaii is where we can see sort of modern surfing arise, but there's also, as you say, the Palmalu, where they've been doing it for a long time. And you feel that. You're standing there, you're seeing something that other people have seen centuries ago and feeling it. And that's primal fear. I love it. In fact, when I was spelling, you said Palmalu, it just reminded me that on one of my trips over there was a guy that I just bumped into, a local fellow, and he had a plumbing business, Palmalu Plumbing.
Oh, wow.
And I asked him for one of his work shirts that I wore till it was thread there. Just, I don't know. Yeah. Favourite shirt for a long time.
Yeah, great.
So where did you go from there, Stu? I heard in your story that something as both maybe mundane but also tumultuous as a wipeout did inspire deeper compassion in you. How did you move forward with those changes in your own life? Where did you go from there?
Oh, well, I didn't make the best use of my potential for a long time. I'd finished university, dropped out 6 months before graduation, and bummed around for a long time. I felt I had to do it. This is before the Hawaiian experience. And I felt like I kind of had to go out and get some dirt under my fingernails. And I was doing philosophy at university, and it didn't feel tangible. I felt I had to go out and put on a blue-collar singlet, and have something and do something. And I wanted to be working class and drink beers on a Friday afternoon. And I did all that. I just did it all. But I wasn't really making much of myself, and I was developing some pretty bad habits and addictions and all sorts of things like that, and just sort of coasting along. Then the Hawaii experience happened, and I had to just build myself up for a while. I ended up working in a graphic design business and printing business, which is kind of odd because I'm not a visual person. I think in words, not images. But anyway, I was going somewhere with that, and it felt good to be actually creating things and making sort of a mark on the world. And it felt like I was getting somewhere after my friends had sort of had a 10-year head start on me, that was beginning to happen for me. But it didn't really happen until Swellnet came along, I guess. As I mentioned, I had a printing and graphic design business, and it was going okay. Printing wasn't in a good place at the time, but I was writing a lot. I was going back to my philosophy days at university, and I was writing a lot, and I was just putting it up for free online, just in one particular forum, but also in a few other ones. And I just got noticed by Ben Matson, who's now a good friend of mine, and he owns Swellnet. And we sort of became friends for a while and hung out. We did a road trip at one point from Sydney to South Australia, where I went surfing over the Eyre Peninsula. He went back to see his parents in Adelaide. We got to know each other, and then he offered me a job that I just wasn't expecting at all, and told me what it was. He'd seen my writing. He'd seen my writing online, and he said, "You got something, mate." And so offered me the job as the editor of Swellnet. And I sold up my print business, and I was working with Swellnet within a week. That felt like it was getting somewhere. And I think my opinions that I hold and the worldview that I have has some element of what went on in Hawaii. And I think I think it's just granted me something that gives me a bit of an overview. I don't think it's necessarily a big advantage over other people, but I can look. Perhaps it's philosophical training as well, where you can look at someone else's point of view, just accept it. Doesn't have to develop animosity about it, but you can just listen to it and accept it.
That's experiential knowledge, isn't it?
Yeah.
It allows you to speak from a lived place instead of just the theoretical. Can you tell us about Kurungaba? That was one of the reasons we really wanted to chat with you, because Dave and I got together in 2010. Right now we're looking at an issue from
2010.
July 2010.
Yeah, I've got that one in the shed.
We have a few around the house, and it was and is still such a novel, special publication, of which I've never seen anything similar around the world in terms of writing about surfing culture coming from not only an academic place, but just a deeply thoughtful and interdisciplinary place. Can you tell us about the concept, where it came from, and where you ran with it?
Before I go there, that was printed at my old printing business.
Great.
So is Kurungaba indicative of the kinds of writings that you were putting out into the world that got you noticed in the first place?
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, it was. Kurungaba began from a small sort of nucleus of us. There was Clifton Evers, Alex Leonard, and a lady, Dinah El Dasuki. She was of Egyptian descent. She lived in California. And we just weren't getting, there was nothing for us in surf magazines at the time. I think it began around 2007, so just pre-GFC, I think. And if you look back at surf magazines at the time, they were this fat, and it was all ads. The industry was riding high on advertising dollars, and they had the publishers and editors sort of over a barrel in a way. They were dictating, to me, it felt like surf culture. And so it was a kind of a reaction against that. We wanted to read some things about the things we were thinking about and that weren't being presented anywhere. It's like surf culture was kind of a closed shop at that point. So we just had the idea, just sort of there's enough people, like if you go onto websites and forums at the time, a lot of people were putting expressing themselves, and about things that they'd done, trips that they'd done, their views on design, their views on contests or anti-contests, whatever it might be. And it just felt like there was a lot of people taking advantage of the opportunity to express themselves. But it was also disappearing into the ether because it was on forums. So it was just a way to capture that. And so the four of us began that, and it was originally going to be called Yulong. It's a local Dharawal Aboriginal word for meeting place, but we weren't the local Aboriginals they weren't cool on us using that. It's not a word that you can toy with, or even though we weren't really commodifying it, they didn't really want that. So we went the other direction and had Kurungaba was pelican. And I think it's great. It's just it's a great sounding word. It comes off the tongue really well. And there was something just cartoonish about a pelican, and that was our journal. So we ran with that, and everyone had lots and lots of things to throw into it. About a year or two in, we realised there was actually too much interest just for the four of us, and so we expanded. And the next lot of crew came in with so much enthusiasm. I actually think Taylor may have come in, Taylor Miller may have come in then, Oliver Nicholson, who's also from Byron Bay. Peter Bowes was an older guy from the northern beaches of Sydney, and he didn't necessarily share our worldview, but he could write. He really had a strong voice. Rebecca Olive. She came in and she did some great writing as well. And so we were getting all these viewpoints. If it wasn't those people directly writing, then they were soliciting submissions from elsewhere, from friends they knew who they thought had something to say. So you're right, Lauren. It was kind of academic. Sometimes it may have just drifted a little bit too far that way. But we also wanted it just to be thoughtful and considered. And
it is. It was and it is.
Yeah.
So refreshing. So refreshing.
There was a really, really fun time, but it also made me realise that flat structure, that to create things well, it actually showed me that you needed a little bit of a hierarchy. It showed me that everyone had an equal voice in it, but there was some writing appearing that I, for instance, wouldn't have ticked off. I wouldn't have given the mark to.
Yeah, right.
So it actually just taught me at the time just to be a little bit more judicious with editing, maybe with approaching people to do second drafts, third drafts, fourth drafts. We found it hard to do that because none of us had the editorial experience, and all contributors were contributing for free. So it's hard to ask someone to give more of their time to do a second draft and to keep working at things. So, but it actually made me realise just how it was really good to have everyone with the equal voice, but it was, I think, quality, it goes up when you have everyone has an assigned role, and it goes off like that. So also, the later issues Taylor got printed up, and I know they were all paid for, but those earlier ones I printed them all for free, and we really didn't get any money from that. As a commercial operation, it wasn't much of a success.
Oh, well, I know for me at that time, one of my favourite aspects of what you were printing was the dance between art and sort of intellect, creativity, and also pretty much straight up journalism, where one of my favourite pieces was one of Shep's insights into Rip Curl's attempts to bring the search event to Lennox Head. And we live at the north end of that very same beach, and we know the general climate of the culture around here, and there's a lot of well-educated and very feisty people in this area, and who love to turn up at town meetings and things. And anyway, you just never heard about any of those sort of characters in all those typical streams of media that were dominated by the big surf companies. So I remember reading that, and it was just great because Shep was, putting his phone number in there for Ridgeway and different people to call him, and he was just calling out the tactics and the strategies that the corporate realm would employ to do events like that, which you'd never hear about in any way whatsoever in other publications. I really loved that. I thought it wasn't an unkind or nasty thing he was doing. He was just telling us what was happening, and for those of us who lived here, it was just like, man, what a great service, what a need this is fulfilling. And I don't know, you can tell I kind of get fired up about it because it was like, for me, during the decades of really being entrenched in the surfing industry and trying to encourage conversations of that nature with Billabong or with surf magazines on certain social and ecological issues, it was always pushing shit uphill. It was so hard. It just, you really had to pretty much force people's hands by saying things overtly in the public and then making them, the companies or whoever, carry out certain acts just because the public are now expecting them to. You couldn't have a meeting before doing anything potentially confrontational or whatever, or potentially damaging their bottom line. It was just a very dominated space by those companies. So yeah, I know for myself and others who got to see snippets of Kurungaba, it was really refreshing.
Well, that's why when I mentioned we came into being around 2007, 2008, when surf magazines were just chunky tomes, but it wasn't full of writing, it was full of ads. More than half the magazine was ads, and they were the ones who ended up controlling the editorial direction. It's no problem for me to say that now.
Yeah, advertorial. It was just straight up. Yeah.
So there was it wasn't going to happen in Phil Jarrett era tracks. It was in the past. You weren't going to get someone siding with surfers anymore. As much as the editors might, their hands were tied. So for Steve to do something like that was just a freedom that just wasn't allowed anywhere else at the time. And it was that piece, that particular piece from memory, it was submitted we ran it just verbatim as Steve sent it in, and it was got an amazing structure. If you look at the timeline, how he writes, there's one point where he speaks directly to the reader, and he says, "I'm going to present what follows as if it happened on one day." And so it was all these events that happened over weeks, but he presents it as if the sun's moving across the sky just one. And so you're into it. It gets a reader, aside from what the content is and what it means for people, it's just really, really entertaining. And I didn't realise who Steve Shearer was at the time. I didn't work for Swellnet. And it wasn't until I did work for Swellnet and then it sort of put it together. And I was like, oh, wow, you're the guy who wrote that. I had the same experience too, where Steve wrote an article that ended up, or a story. It was semi-fictional story that was in Deep when Nick Carroll was editing it. Or when it existed, because it was another one that
that's right.
went dry. It was called High Plains Drifter, and it was Steve sharing his time on trawlers off the WA's northwest coast and spending time in Kalbarri and the attitudes of local surfers and trying to get in there. And there was this, I won't go right into it, but there's something to be said about surf culture and localism. And Steve mixed it up with his experiences. And it wasn't until later on, I'm like, when I went back and reread it, it signed off the byline, Steve Shearer. I'm like, he's done all this marvellous stuff, and now he's forecasting for the company I work for. So, it was good that Kurungaba could get guys like that, girls like that too, but these voices that just weren't going to be heard anywhere else.
We're at a really interesting point in surf storytelling globally, Stu, and just to bring your work up into the present, you were publishing Kurungaba, now working for Swellnet. And at this point in the history of storytelling, we're seeing again a singular entity really dominating surf storytelling globally, homogenizing surf storytelling in a way that maybe has never quite been before. And I'm talking about Surfline, of course, buying up place-based, locally situated surf forecasting, but also storytelling organizations. That's happened here in Australia fairly recently. And I wanted to talk with you about what that means for our culture and why that matters.
Yeah, I often wonder about this. I really think we're worse for it, that we don't have lots of voices. And even though everyone's got a voice on social media, it disappears in a day. It's gone. Social media has no history. And just as a quick sort of like tangent, I think it's one of the reasons that kids don't know a lot about surf history. It's not that they don't want to know; they just don't have a place to discover it. Like I could read tracks magazines that sat on the shelves for years and read Derek Hines stories about Dale Egan or about Tommy Zahn or about all these things that sat there, and Derek informed us about our history, and I could read it then or I could read it later on. But you can't do that with any of the online tools. It's really hard. So, I think that there's something fundamentally changed in the way that we consume our surf media. And the effects are being felt in social media, but also there's sort of monopolization going on. And I just don't think that's a good thing for anyone, whether it be the WSL monopolising surfing, capital S, or with Surfline just buying everything up around. I think it's really, really good to have multiple voices from our side, to have multiple competitors, other people. It drives us forward. We're losing that. And I think at the moment, I sometimes feel like, what's going on in surfing? Because I never had to ask that question back in the day. You could see everything. Like, there was lots of different things happening, and despite all the different ways to sort of catch up with news, it feels like things have just been narrowed. Like, the potential cast of stories is narrowed. It shouldn't be that way, but it feels like it to me.
Do you think we'll see a rise of the zine in some sort of way? Do you think there will be, out of this sort of vacuum that's happening, something new will be born that isn't really new, but maybe there'll be an opening in some way where people feel this deficit and feel like, oh, what are we doing here?
There has to be like a business model for it, even just a small, if it's a small business. But I really feel like in the last maybe 5-6 years, that I'm going to extrapolate out just a little bit for one moment. I really feel like sort of there's a sense that globalization has reached its limits, in the sense that where there's just too many negatives in it, and it feels like the pendulum's swinging back a little bit towards something more intimate, more community minded. It's going that way. We're not so outwards looking as we were. We're coming back in. And I think, as you said, Dave, I think that if people can just start creating, because if social media has shown us something, it's that people want to express themselves. They really want to express themselves. It can be, they may not have much to say, but they really want to. It's the same as people want to graffiti walls. It's just self-expression. So if people can harness that, and they know enough about our history, or they know enough about the threads of surf culture, I can see that there's a growing local interest in things. As I see things sort of contracting a little bit in politics, where our nation state isn't as outward looking necessarily as it was. It's happening down on the street level as well, where people are just, and maybe COVID brought us that way. Like, for a few years there, you couldn't go anywhere. You were forced to live and just mix with people in your LGA. I mean, in a sense, that was a good thing. Like, you got to meet all your neighbours and got to do, you weren't jet setting around the world. To get to your question, Dave, I can foresee like a time in the near future where zines and whatever else may be, but maybe in sort of like a hard copy, a tangible thing, can be created and handed down and just kept. And I think I think that's the one thing that the internet is just always going to miss. There's just that tactile experience, that way of capturing it for good. Like it's one of the things that I'm sort of proud of. A lot of the writing that I've done on Swellnet, but man, it disappears quickly. It really, it's gone. I would like to see some of the other people's thoughts and everything like that just captured and just put on shelves and tucked away. And if I can just have another little tangent, if you'll indulge me here.
Please.
When we were when we'd sort of built up a little bit of a head of steam at Coolangatta, I took an email from Graham Murdoch at Morrison Media, who was running just ASL and maybe the other Morrison Media mastheads at the time. He was inquiring about doing the graphic design and layout for us. And we were like, yeah. None of us could do that. We could write. We just couldn't lay it all out. And you see the work that Gra's done. He's been working at Surfing Life since like 86 or 87. And he's brilliant when it comes to art direction and whatnot. We said, yeah, that would be really great, Gra. He went to speak to his boss and mentor, he considers him, Peter Morrison, and PM just said no and put the kibosh on it. It was going to be a bit too much of a conflict there. Shortly thereafter, White Horses came out. And Gra, I remember interviewing him way back on the first edition, and I felt like they'd picked up the baton somewhat. You know, their tagline is "The sea has stories," and so it's surfers. In White Horses, the editor is invisible. There's no editorial voice. It's all about the readers. And it felt to me like Gra really dug what was happening at Coolangatta and couldn't come aboard design, but got White Horses going instead. And look, I mean, it's been going for so many years now. It's a success. He's got his mates in there like Bainey and Craig Sims, who also help out now. But yeah, it felt like that was the next extension. We couldn't keep Kurungaba going. We all had other jobs. It wasn't a commercial success, as I said. But to a degree, White Horses continued on.
Please stay tuned while we take a quick break to acknowledge the folks who help make our podcast possible.
If the first 50 years were an experiment,
to prove that a business could be
responsible
and successful,
turns out it's not just possible,
it's profitable.
So what's next?
What's next is simple. It's human-powered, and it's finding the joy in doing difficult things.
What's next is turning capitalism on its head
and putting all our money where our mouth is.
What's next is unstoppable.
Thanks to Patagonia for their continued support this season and for prioritizing purpose over profit to protect our wondrous planet, our only home. Sanuk has been advocating for a more playful and inclusive surfing culture for more than 2 decades while crafting some of the comfiest footwear around. Thanks for your support, Sanuk, and for encouraging water people around the globe to protect their happy places. Learn more about Sanuk's partnership with the Surfrider Foundation at sanuk.com.
The other day, Stu, we were having a brief yarn and you had a pretty radical mountain bike stack recently and we were talking about the difference, or you were sharing with me your perspective of the difference between mountain bike culture and surfing culture and some of the, I guess, jewels that we have within the surf organism that might not be embedded in other, I guess, subcultures like mountain biking or whatever. Are you able to speak to that a little bit? Because I really appreciated what you were talking about when it comes to history. And
yeah, I did a few years of mountain bike riding in the 90s and gave it up when the injuries got the better of me. And at some point in the late 90s, I was living at Cronulla at the time, my downhill bike and all my helmets and everything got stolen, and I didn't even report it to the cops. It was just like, it's gone. I'm done with that sport. It's over. But then about 2018 or something like that, my oldest boy started, he didn't really take to the beach so much, but he's a little bush rat. And we live here at the foothills of the Illawarra Escarpment. He loves the bush. And so I kind of followed him up there and saw what he was doing. I went, oh man, I want a part of this. You know, like, this is great. It's just so accessible. Like we've got the beach 500 meters that way. We've got the trailhead 500 meters that way. And so I got right into it for a while there, like right into it. And just being the person that I am, I kept on looking for these parallels between surfing and mountain bike riding. The culture's one of them. What it does to your body's another thing. The effects, the psychological effects of it, all these things, I'll just be thinking, what are the parallels here? What are the parallels? And there are many parallels, I think, about like your mindset when you're surfing big waves to your mindset when you're on the mountain. There are certain things that that do actually have big overlap. One of the things where there isn't an overlap is that there isn't a very rich mountain bike culture. I know there are pockets of it in Canada, like in Vancouver and the North Shore, Vancouver's North Shore and things like that. But in general, it's not a rich culture that you can make movies about, you can create clothing labels about, you can tell these fictional stories about, that we've had these revolutions within. Just hasn't happened. It's not a thing. Like mountain biking was born in Marin County, just across the bay from San Francisco. Hardly any mountain bikers know that. They just don't even know it. But what surfer hasn't heard of Duke Hanamoku? You know, doesn't know our origin story. They're just not interested in the history. It's just a different sport like that. And also part of it, no one's ever made their bike, really. There is no down-home manufacturing as there is in surfing. Like surfing was once a real cottage industry. It's gone big manufacturing, but there is. I went into a mate's surfboard factory this morning and I smelt the resin and the foam dust and saw all the different designs that he was playing with. And it was great. You know, each board sort of speaks to a certain era. The artwork that's on it, the type of waves they're supposed to be ridden in, and you just, like, you might as well be buying a set of golf clubs when it comes to bikes. You can have particular bikes, but, you know, they're factory made. You don't know the person who made them. There is just nothing there that where there's design that's intertwined with the culture. That's just one thing. I also think that Australian surfing is really, really lucky to have gone through, even if you didn't live it at the time, I think it's really lucky to have gone through the country soul period of the 70s. That has shown another way of living surfing life outside of competition. At the moment, we've got things like the WSL and Surfing Australia trying to co-opt all of surfing. They're trying to do everything within surfing. They're trying to be all of surfing, but there's always now this different avenue. We know that surfing can be this different thing, and we may not be making the original movies and everything the way that Albie did, and even guys like Mick Waters and Nathan Oldfield do their bit, but there'll always be this other road presented that we can take. And so that there's no sort of like diversity within the culture in mountain biking like there is within surfing. So
yeah, I think that really speaks to the origin story of surfing. If we trace it back to Polynesia, for Hawaiians, surfing was about competition, but it was also about romance, and it was about community, and it was about play, and it was for everyone. And when I think about surf culture now, and I see the swelling of diversity in terms of, different kinds of people getting in the water, different boards, and also this acceptance of the different streams or roads you were talking about, different ways to be within the surfing organism. Yeah, I think that diversity has always been a part of surfing culture, even though the surfing industry hasn't been so quick to recognize that.
I think if I could just mention about like competition, I'm not necessarily anti-competition. I think good surfers by nature are competitive. I hate to say it, Dave, but you're competitive.
When I play badminton, people see that side of me and go, "Oh yeah, there it is." Yeah.
If you're going to get sets, if you're going to improve your surfing, if you're going to surf deeply and intensely and strong, you're going to be competitive. But if it's just some days just competition within yourself, you are competitive. You can sit there and be at one with nature, but there's a part of you that's quite operating at a level that is you need to be on your game. You need to be that. So I'm not really anti-competitive. I'm anti sort of structural. No, I'm sorry. I'm sort of indifferent to structural competition, like a nice day at the beach and you have to paddle out for 20 minutes and then come in and you surf against one person. I find that it's a little bit alien to me. But the diversity within surfing, I think, I was brought up in a time where there wasn't much diversity in surfing. And it's something that I've had to get my head around where I realize now, wow, there's lots of different ways of being a surfer. It came to me first, nothing to do with gender or age, but just with boards, I went through the 80s where 6.0 thruster, that was it. It wasn't even asked sort of what length or how many fins or anything like that. That's what it was. And then things started to expand in the 90s, following a mix of Tom Curran's exploration and I'd have to also say Andrew Kidman, John Frank and Mark Sutherland and the work that they did through Waves magazine and also ending with Litmus. They shone a light on a different way of being and different boards to ride. And I can remember at the time in 1994, Trax ran an article, "What is a fish?" Australian surfers did not know what a fish surfboard was. It's hard to believe now. But that's where we were at the time. And so all these other boards started coming along, and that shows a different ways of surfing, different approach to surfing, different waves that can be surfed, and which in turn made surfing accessible to younger people, to women in different circumstances. It just didn't have to be that young guy. Look, that sort of it was just open to many other people. And at first, I guess maybe just internally I'm talking about here. I just might have been protective about it, but you can only see the good that comes from it. I mean, a surfing lineup where there's a mix of people in it is a healthier lineup. It's sort of where there's other viewpoints. I still do like it when it's matey, but not all the time. And so now there's so many different ways of being a surfer. Like the ABC ran a story the other day about middle-aged women getting into surfing, and it was this big. I couldn't believe it. I was like, not just a few, but a lot. And it's surf culture is expanding out like this. I find it hard to write about, actually, because when I write, I have to be in tune with something. I have to sort of have my finger on the pulse. So I feel like I'm a bit of an imposter if I pretend I know what's going on with other people's impulses to start surfing. So it's probably something I should set about finding out about, but I don't know it intuitively at all.
I'm curious to know, Stu, thanks for sharing too, where philosophy and surfing meet. What is the line that isn't utter cheeseball when we try to bring those two things together? And how do you possibly dance that line, being someone in your position that's like a conduit for so many people coming and sending things to where you write Swellnet, and then it coming in and then going back out into the world? How do you dance that line?
The line is about this thin, Dave.
Millimeters.
Between inspired writing and utter cheeseball. It is a dance that you can do. But like I mentioned Steve Shearer's pieces before. I could mention quite a few of Steve's. And I just use him as an example. But if he gave into his emotions just a bit too much, some of his writing would be cheeseball. It would be overly wrought. It would be too dramatic. It would be trying to force its hand. But instead, he just reins it in enough. It's a discipline. It's a discipline. He just reins it in enough that it doesn't go there. But he does actually allow people to experience his viewpoint, and that's philosophical training. That's adopting a viewpoint and then creating a little crow's nest and welcoming other people to come up and take a look around. That is philosophical training. To be curious about another person's viewpoint, it could be offensive to you. I mean, there's a lot of that goes on in social media at the moment, where there's people write all sorts of outrageous things. Rather than reacting against it and telling them to shove it or anything like that, just try to, I wonder where did that come from? Like, what drove a person to think that way? It's just a curiosity that, just by thinking about it and trying to understand it doesn't mean you subscribe to it, but it can help you to argue against it because you know how that person arrived at that point. So there's all these things. Surfing doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's all these things going on. It could be the big business, like taking over the magazines. It could be Rip Curl wanting to run a contest at Lennox Head. There's all these things. There's all these areas, these touch points where like good philosophical training can provide you like a point to access that argument and then provide your opinion. And it's not just some knee-jerk reaction. You've thought about it. You can back it up when people start attacking you. And so there's lots and lots of it. But I wouldn't have been a very good writer in my 20s. Wouldn't have happened. I would have been terrible. I would have been sacked. I was all those things that I thought Steve was a dalliance with. I would have gone too far and been too indulgent. So I'm fortunate that I started writing seriously in my 30s, and I had experiences, not just what had happened at Sunset, although that was a telling one, but I had the old saying, I've been out there and I'd got some dirt under my fingernails and I'd seen what people thought, and I'd measured my own thought processes and worldviews, and I've turned it over in my head. And so in a way, I was just fortunate that I got the microphone when a little bit later in life.
I think I hear what you're saying there, and I think about how we communicate with each other, and certainly I'm not someone who participates in social media, but I really have an interest in it, and I speak with Lauren about it a lot and other friends who participate in it heavily, and it doesn't seem that structure often lends itself to the best parts of each other. And one of the things I've really appreciated with chatting with Lauren about this is that Lauren has a past of going to university, of learning how to learn, of learning how to communicate when there is tensions or different worldviews, And I feel like this is an area of interest for me, but I'm quick to, I don't know, be defensive or quick to react in a certain way. And I really appreciate what you're saying and being able to, get up in the crow's nest with other people and perceive from their point of view. I was just wondering, Lauren, if you had any thoughts around that, on how surfing is going right now with communicating to itself and where we can move forward being our best selves.
Yeah, you would be a target if you went onto social media, Dave, unfortunately. You would have to develop a really thick skin. I know I had to. I certainly don't have anywhere near the presence that you do, but I wrote things and a lot of people attacked me, still do at times, but you just shrug it off. Social media, well, it's just not going away. And so we have to figure out ways to navigate its use. And social media is really only one part of communicating about surfing. I might also mention Graham Murdoch again. And I think Graham's going to laugh at me when he hears all this. But I like the way that he uses social media, that he really does. He comes and goes a lot, but he just uses it in a nice way. And it's not, I don't just mean in an innocent way here, like, here's the dinner I'm eating tonight. But just a few funny little thoughts, things he's picked up on the beach, photo of himself, but it's self-deprecating. And it just generates nice little comment threads. And another guy down in Torquay, Mick Sowry, who had Great Road Quarterly for a while, I think he does the same, where he uses it, but not in any, sometimes those photos that he's taking, he's not humble bragging. He's just sharing. And it sort of invites people to also share in good faith. And it's just nice when you scroll across and you see those sort of things, people sharing, and there's no ego in it. There's nothing. They're not trying to sort of use it as a stepping stone to something else. It's the kind of thing that they would say if you bumped into them down the street. And I like it. I think it's sort of, when you see people like that use it that way, it's nice to actually share, to just say, yeah, man, that's, maybe take part in it, but also just to think about the way that ourselves use it, and we can do that. We can communicate with each other and stay in each other's lives a bit through social media, but using it in a gentle, nice way. What was the second part of the question, Dave? Was it about how surfing can communicate?
Yeah, I think one of the things, well, you can speak to it more than me, when you ask questions, when you use Instagram or other platforms to ask people and you prod in that way. Can you share your thinking about that, how you do that?
Like used to, I started studying philosophy at university and more than anything just became captivated by learning how to ask good questions and sort of being satisfied with the idea of not necessarily coming to firm answers, but just living in the questions in some ways. And I find social media really, for all its faults, and for the way, it sometimes disguises itself as connection when in fact it's just connectivity. Still, I think it can be a way to, like you said, connect and stay in each other's lives, even in sort of mundane, regular kinds of ways.
If you don't mind me just talking about Swellnet for a moment, I get people that sort of occasionally on the side can sort of congratulate, tap on the shoulder about the way the comments or forums curated. Not that I do much these days in the way of curation, but just the people who have gathered around it. It's not always pretty, but there is lots and lots of viewpoints, and it's kind of self-moderated to a point where people aren't necessarily trying to convince other people. When you keep trying to convince the other person, that's the beginnings of an argument. You can try to persuade someone, you can prosecute your argument, but that person can also disagree with it. And if they've got a considered and thought out viewpoint, well, you just have to agree to disagree. And we've sort of, I think at first, I really wanted the forums and comments to just have to be another outward part of my beliefs. Over time, it's brought around to like right, left, centre left, all these various people in viewpoints in politics, and that's the way it should be. I'm really, really glad that there's these other viewpoints come out. I don't. There's some things I read on there, and I mean the offensive stuff has to go. That doesn't stay. But when there's people who just have different points of view and they're considered, they've given you this précis like this about why they think that way. I'm like, man, it's sort of like the Voltaire thing. It's just, like, I don't agree with you, but I'll defend your right to say it. And it's been educational for me. We're at a good point, here, because we're not drawing arms. We're just not agreeing. Ultimately, it's like the Michel de Montaigne thing. It's like the most boring conversation is the one where everyone agrees. We're having this online conversation, and there's lots of viewpoints, and we don't all agree. And it can be really sort of entertaining and enlightening, and we can kind of start learning things from each other.
You mentioned history a few times over the course of this conversation, Stu. I've also been really concerned, specifically on the women's side of things, that there hasn't been a place for women's engagement with surfing to live continuously. If you picked up any surf mag, pulled up any surf, sort of endemic surf website these days, you might see a few women, but you still might not. And so I wrote a book for some of these stories to live. And I've just, I wanted to reference what you said earlier that I loved so much, that social media has no history. That's so important for us to remember. And I wanted to ask you, why does that matter? Why does history matter? What do we gain as a culture by having a firm understanding of where we've come from?
Well, can I just rewind just a moment? I'd just like to say that Swellnet doesn't have a strong female presence, and it's both a good thing and a bad thing, because we've wondered how to grow that, because there is some, but there's also an element where people like the menschettery of it. They like to feel sort of a collegiate sense of fraternity with people just like them. And I totally get that they want to feel a belonging there. But at the same time, I really think there has to be a place for women, and we haven't managed to do that. So that's one of our shortcomings, and I'm not exactly sure how that can be overcome. The history aspect, well, I think I'm not just going to say something, if you don't know your history, you don't know the future. I think if you don't know your history, then you're much more open prey to the forces of commerce. I think that you don't have a grounding in sort of the way in the path forward. You don't have a sense of a place within a deeper place within a culture, that you're one of many. I know that when I was aware through writing that when I went to Hawaii, I was just one person in a long, long lineage. I'm not Polynesian, obviously, but I'm a surfer. And I'd read the books by Bruce Jenkins and whatnot in the history of Hawaii, and I felt like I was a proud surfer. I really, really, really felt that I was part of something that was deeper and meaningful, and that wouldn't exist in a world without any history, where it's just continually made up on the spot. So, look, it's hard to see how we're going to rectify it. Perhaps it's going to have to be this comeback of print that we were talking about. But yeah, I think things that you were doing, Lauren, like putting it into books. See, book sales are so low at the moment, but I think it's just they're there. And one person reads them, it sits on your shelf. Another person comes around your house, they read it. They ask to borrow it, and that someone else reads it. Your son reads it when he comes of age. It's just there for so long. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is speaking of history. So we've wanted to do, I've got a big back catalogue of writing. I'd love to put it into books. I'd love to have the many voices that have appeared on Swellnet that deserve to speak through the ages. That would be a really good thing to do. But yeah, I feel like it's surfing culture can be really rich, but history is just one aspect that makes you feel like, whoa, you're part of something, man. There's something that links me with Derek Hind, with Bob Pike, with Owen Yateman, with all these people that go back and it all the way, and it just makes you feel like you've got some obligations, to probably too strong a word, but it just connects you through. It's obviously an intangible feeling, but it's there, and it adds richness to the culture.
Yeah. Wonderful. Stu, have you got anything that you would like to discuss, or anything on your mind that you'd like to have a banter with us?
Yeah. One of my bugbears that's been for a while is just the WSL sort of, I mentioned it before, co-opting everything to do with surfing. And these days I see Surfing Australia sort of operating from the same playbook. They have, to their credit, they have started doing things, providing like special days for women surfers, or holding resuscitation days so surfers can learn how to resuscitate a surfer that's in need. But Surfing Australia, always their primary purpose will be to administer the competitive side of surfing. But if you go within their charter, in their constitution, it's actually also, there's a couple of points there where it's to provide for the amenity of recreational surfers. Look, there was many, many years where they did nothing for recreational surfers, not nothing at all. They didn't turn up to any protests. They didn't sit down at any of the meetings. Like I remember a few years back, there was a surfer that died after being struck by a boat that was going through Currumbin Alley. And the waterway had recently been dredged, and they invited everyone to the meeting of what was going to happen. They invited the fishermen, the boaters union, or the council. Surfers weren't sitting at that meeting table, and they should have been sitting at that meeting table. And Surfing Australia should have been the ones facilitating it. If it wasn't them, they should have got someone to be there. So I just think that there's no voice for the recreational surfer. Surfing Australia is kind of pretending they are, but Surfing Australia has 20,000 members. They've got 20,000 members, but they will take money from the government on behalf of all of us. I don't know how many surfers there are in Australia, 300,000, but these 20,000, and there should be a pool of money that's coming from government. If that's what government's giving to surfers, there should be some coming towards us, and it should be to look into things like it should be environmental matters. It should be to look into the potential of like artificial reefs. It should be to look into mental health things, but it should not just be going to this small factor of people to be sent to contests and things such as that. As I mentioned, it's great that they're expanding their purview a little bit, but I think they've got a long way to go. That's my point there.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I feel that, again, it's sort of that dominant voice, that loud dominant voice, and that is the predominant voice. The hyper-competitive corporate voice has been the dominant voice in surfing for a long time. Do you feel like that's different, though? Because I feel like it's differing now. I feel like we have an opportunity perhaps for that to have less clout.
Yeah, well, see, people have other ways of getting a platform. Like you, Dave, like you can do this with Lauren, and this is a way. Like, look at the amount of podcasts that are out there. So that's the way you guys are providing a different voice. So it is happening. The problem is it's also fracturing. The good thing back in the day of magazines is that there was 3 or 4 magazines, and yes, you captured the whole audience. And so it was very easy to see what the surf culture was doing and have the sort of gatekeepers, editors, quality controlling what was going through and what was being said, and you could capture it. You could speak to everyone, nearly everyone. Wanted a monthly edition, you could speak to them. That ended up being sort of abused or whatever you'd say when those voices got beholden by the big companies. So, but I do sort of think there's value in that when there's just you can somehow harness a lot of people with one outlet. So the fracturing of the media isn't a great thing, although it does give people like a sort of a real range of viewpoints. It is actually happening where you can tune into other people. Like, I mean, you look at, I don't listen to Joe Rogan, but I'm absolutely fascinated that someone like him can have the amount of views that he has. Like, I mean, hits, like people listening to him. So let's just think because he appears to me to be, I don't have any aversion to him at all. I just don't really listen to podcasts. But from what I understand, he does cover many viewpoints, left, right, progressive, conservative. He seems quite open. I mean, imagine if someone within surfing was to be as captivating as Joe is and speak about surfing issues and capture just a fraction of his audience, so all the surfers tuned in. I think, man, that would be something. That would be that's a template for capturing a range of viewpoints within surfing. And so, it would be nice if something like that happened.
Yeah. Well, at least we're in exciting times in that regard. And, like I'm sure you can relate to that period in time, say the 2000s, where like 2005 onwards there, it just felt like the sort of the corporate juggernaut within surfing was just going to umbrella everything. And I'm myself, I think this is a really dynamic time right now. And though some structures are crumbling, others are growing through the cracks. And it's just great. And like when we chat just last week, I think it was, we're having a quick yarn about some surfboard design and whatnot. That's really what gave me the inspiration for us to have a yarn with you, where it's just nice to be able to feel that you can plumb some of the depths within surfing, and then, that manages to go out into the world and spark a few other conversations. And it's like I said earlier, I'm not really on the internet, but when you're in the car park after a surf or before a surf and you're getting to have yarns with people about things that might have spiked their interest on the internet, and you can sit in the sun after a cold surf and have a good long yarn with people, I'm finding that that's happening these days in a way that I don't really remember that happening as a grommet at Burleigh in the late 90s. I don't think there were those kind of conversations happening that consistently back then.
Yeah, no, I think things are definitely healthier in that way, that there's just more, it can be the same people, we're still surfers, just bringing in a range of viewpoints. And you've still got the Mad Hatter shapers with their crazy ideas and their sort of their little competitive things that they've got going on amongst each other and their weird viewpoints. And I love them all for that. And surfing's always going to have that sort of thing, as long as we've got a cottage industry where people are willing to experiment and do all those crazy things. That's kind of that jumbala of just throw all these ideas in and see what happens. Like we did, like the story the other day with Gaz. I mean, it's almost a template for beginning a conversation where you just take these viewpoints from here and here and here, and let's just work it up into something. Yeah. So it's a healthier way of being now. There's just more things accepted. Starting with surfboard design, that's what he's saying, but also just in what we'll accept within the surf culture, whether it be the diversity, whether, all those things. It's a healthier way when you sort of are less judgmental and more accepting of the things that are happening within the culture, and just try not to feel too much ownership over it all.
Yeah.
You might have done it for a long time, but it's not yours. You just there's a lot of people who, because of their longevity, just feel that they've got a louder voice. I think when people get to that age and they're no longer listening to other people, that's when the hatred sort of, or not hatred's too strong a word, but that's when the frustration and the lack of evolving, that's when the rot starts to set in. So I just kind of guard myself against ever being that kind of surfer.
Yeah.
And hopefully just accepting, sometimes it might be hard, but just accepting all the things that are happening around me within surf culture. Hopefully I can remain totally curious about them at all and get my head around it all. But, at the very least, just be accepting of it.
Thanks so much for listening with us today. If you like what you heard, please consider sharing an episode with a friend. Our editor this season is the multi-talented Ben Alexander. The podcast soundtrack was composed by Shannon Sol Carroll, with additional tunes by Dave and Ben. We'll be continuing today's conversation on Instagram, where we're at Water People Podcasts, and you can subscribe to our very infrequent newsletter to get book recommendations, questions we're pondering, behind-the-scenes glimpses into recording the podcast, and more via our website, waterpeoplepodcasts.com.